You all look way too happy to hear about this LARP. This is a sad and serious LARP. I'm happy to talk about Europa. The LARP was held 15 years ago, in 2001. And it was a LARP about refugee issues. In many ways, things that were highly relevant then and have become highly or even more relevant today. And it's an old LARP. Like most of the LARPs you hear about here have been played much more recently. Europa was played only once. It wasn't designed to be rerunnable. Rerunning LARPs was a very strange idea at the time. But first, a bit of background. Festung Europa, the fortress of Europe. Beginning in roughly the early 1980s, the countries in Western Europe started shutting down their borders. While labor migration had been welcome in the decade before, labor migrants were no longer welcome. To move from one country inside Festung Europa, these days known as the Schengen area, would be easy, both to travel and to migrate. But if you were from outside of this region, the borders would for all practical purposes be closed. Now, this left the European countries with a bit of a problem, because some of the people who tried to enter into Europe did not do so because they merely were looking for an education or a job. They did so because they were running away from something. They were running away from war, they were running away from persecution, they were running away from hunger. And so the European governments looked through their own legislation and discovered, in the optimistic years after World War II, they had signed all these treaties and conventions and so on, where they agreed to guarantee the right of refugees. The most important of these is Article 14 of the Declaration of Human Rights, which states that people have a right to apply for asylum or find asylum from persecution. Now that the borders were closed, what would this mean in practice? The compromise the European countries came up with, which exists to this day, was that the borders would remain closed, no visas would be issued to people who might be refugees, but if somebody managed to get their feet onto European soil and said the magic words, "I apply for asylum," in that case, they would not be immediately deported, but they would instead be put through a long and arduous legal process based on arcane legal principles to see if they fulfilled the legal requirements to be considered a refugee. If they were, which happens in 10 to 60% of the cases, depending on the country and government, they would be given a residence permit and other support, which they were entitled to as refugees. Otherwise, they would be deported. To get inside European territory, of course, you would need to sneak in, because the borders, again, were closed. Now, this system came under a lot of strain in the 1990s, when suddenly we had war on European soil again, in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. 2 waves of refugees came out of that situation. The first one out of the Bosnian War in 1992 to 1996, and then again in the lead-up to the Kosovo crisis in 1999. But there were Kosovo refugees arriving many years in advance of this. 99 was merely the peak. And what these refugees met when they came to, especially Northern Europe, which was kind of far away and a little bit ignorant. We didn't really understand that there were different nationalities in the Balkans. They would be stewed together on hastily constructed asylum reception centers, which were temporary camps where they were supposed to stay until they received an answer to their application for asylum. 1999 was also the year I started working with an NGO that worked with refugee rights. I encountered many refugees, both from Southeast Europe and from other parts of the world. I visited reception centers, and I saw that the whole system was really, really fucked up. This made me sad. And as a way of dealing with this frustration, I began working on the LARP. Together with a group of other people in what was known as the Weltschmerz network at the time, we explored art, politics, and LARP. And that LARP was Europa. Our goal with Europa was to simulate the situation of the asylum reception centers for players from our own circles. And the life at the reception centers was pretty much invisible to most of the population in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland. So we would need to take our players into roles that were on the inside of the reception centers. It took the form of a 5-day-long LARP, because in 2001 it wasn't really a LARP unless it was at least 2 days long. So this one was 5 days, which made it a proper real LARP. And it was very much in line with the 360-degree illusion. Everything you saw, felt, touched, heard, and so on should be entirely in-game. It also meant that we had no rules for things like fighting. We basically said that if you're going to fight, you're going to fight. And this was actually a way to discourage players from fighting. We set it in an alternate present. And I'm running very short on time, so I'll have to zoom through very quickly. We said that in this world, it's still 2001, but now there has been a war in the Nordic countries, and you're seeking asylum in a peaceful democratic country on the Balkans called Orsinia. Players from the Nordic countries played characters of their own nationalities. And to simulate the Orsinians, we talked to our friends, the Murmansk Larp community, and had 4 players from Murmansk play reception center personnel. We gave them the same briefing that Norwegian reception center personnel would have received. We also had some part-time characters, bureaucrats, police, and a nurse. Players had no pre-written characters, there was no runtime direction, no dramatic arc, no off-play. In other words, not very much to play on. So we set for our players only a single goal, to experience this. Now you'll have life in a reception center for 5 days, and that's it. Where do you get the character from then? Well, back in 2001, we considered this big blue dot here, the 5 days, to be the Larp. Of course, we had 2 Larps before that, prologues, so-called, where they played previous scenes in the characters' lives during the wars, so that you would get memories to bring into the play. We also had a fairly long thing, which these days would be called a workshop. We call it the entry tunnel, where they played more and more scenes, leading them to arrival in Orsinia. And we spent a very long time ending the Larp and debriefing the Larp. Daily chores also became an important part of the play experience, making food, tidying up stuff, making sure you did not freeze to death at night. And for the players, this Larp had a fairly strong impact. Not always a positive one, in the interest of honesty. Some players did report that it was gruelingly, mind-numbingly boring. And not necessarily meant in a good way. But of course, this was an exact, very accurate simulation of asylum seeker life at a reception center. Another participant later commented that she experienced flashbacks to the Larp when seeing war play out on television news in later years, telling us something about the intensity of the Larp experience. Another player whose character really had to step up and take responsibility during the Larp said that in this realistic simulated environment, he came to Europa a boy and left a man. And the official word, as written by player Susanne Greslund in the book Nordic Larp, in several obvious ways, Europa increased my self-understanding. Of course, it is impossible to wholly put oneself in the shoes of a refugee to really understand what it is like to flee from one's country and head towards the unknown. Neither had we experienced any real war traumas. But even trying to imagine proved to be a valuable exercise in understanding and empathy. This was not intended as an educational Larp. It was, for my sake and for my co-organizer's sake, for us it was an art project. But of course, Europa has opened a lot of angles for discussing both politics and education in live role-playing. And finally, I'm out of time. I'll just show you one scene that doesn't fit the miserable Europa thing, which is the snowball fight. Thank you very much.